Good morning, everybody. Today is Good Friday, which as a Christian is a very important day for me, but it's also April 2nd, which we celebrate as Autism Awareness Day. And I wanted to do a quick talk a little bit about autism awareness, or help you become more aware, maybe, or encourage those who are already aware about autism and looking at it from a different perspective. I've been working in the field of autism for over 20 years, and I had some amazing teachers, especially one at Radford University when I graduated with my master's degree. Dr. Lynn Adams was an autism specialist, and she was the first person who told me, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And when you graduate, I don't know about you, but when you graduate, you have a whole lot of information in your head. And all it feels like sometimes is just information until you start putting it into practice. And that line, once you've met one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism, was really just head knowledge for me when I graduated. But there was one point in time that I remember where things started to click, and I began the understanding more of what autism was and how I was supposed to be called into this world of autism to work with kids and adults who have autism. And it took me understanding a different perspective. So I'm going to tell you a story about the first time that really became something that changed the way I, as a therapist, began working in the field of autism. So it was my first year out of grad school. I was at an inner city preschool in Charlotte, North Carolina with an amazing team of teachers. And I was given you get a caseload as soon as you start. Here are the kids you're going to be serving, and then you're going to be identifying more kids as the year goes on. And so if you're in a preschool, you're seeing kids that are 3, 4, and 5 years old, usually 4 and 5, but in the special ed classrooms, they could be as young as 3. And so I had been given this little kid, we're going to call him John, and he had never spoken. He didn't use any words. And so as a speech language pathologist, fresh out of school, of course I could change the world, right? I could fix this kid. I am the one who could. And so I saw John for the first time, and his teacher said, "Oh, you'll see him. He's over there. He does the same thing every day. He pours water in at the water table or pours sand at the sand table." That was it. Was all he did. He followed the routine, and we go to the transition to places that he needed to transition to, sometimes well, sometimes not, but he didn't talk, and he would only pour water and sand as a play as he played. So the first several sessions, I tried to engage him as I was taught to do. Not well. I didn't do well because I'm still learning. Tried to get him to talk, withheld things, thought that would help. None of it worked. He was not talking. So then when I was about 3 weeks in, I was starting to get really frustrated. And so I finally took the advice of Dr. Lynn Adams and started imitating what he was doing, because whatever he was doing must have been important to him. And I wasn't understanding why. So he was at the water table. He was pouring water from a cup into the water table, picking up water and pouring it, picking up water and pouring it. I was like, okay, so we talk about what you're doing. And I said, water, pour water, water, and you just repeat it over and over as a speech language pathologist, maybe getting him to respond. The next time I went for therapy, it's the sand table. So I did the same thing. Sand, pour, sand, and use those words. So that kind of happened for a few weeks where I went, and we weren't taking turns, but I noticed he was watching me. He started watching me from his periphery because I was doing what he was doing. I was playing in his environment, entering his world, instead of trying to get him to enter my world. Now, I didn't feel like I was making any progress, because progress sometimes can be very, very slow, and consistency is so important. Building that trust, building that consistency. So several weeks in, it was the water table. No, it was the sand table, and he poured sand, and then I poured sand, except when I poured it, I said sand. And then he poured sand, and then I poured sand. And then he poured sand, and this whole time he hadn't looked at me at all, not one smidge of eye contact. He poured his sand, and I had hesitated for a minute, and he poured his sand and he looked straight at me and waited because it was my turn. Now, you guys might not see that as a big deal, but if you know about autism, that is a big deal because I had entered his world, he had let me in his world, and we were communicating. He looked at me because it was my turn. So trying not to freak out because I saw this as a big deal, I poured the sand and said, sand. And then he poured the cup, his own sand, and looked at me again. My turn again. So I did it again. Third time. I love this story because it just really was one of those moments where you're like, oh, I just learned something. He may not have, but I did. He poured his sand. I picked up my cup and he looked at me again, my turn, and I picked up my cup and I hesitated. And he looked straight at me and he said, sand. And I poured the sand. We did an exchange. Not only was it visual, eye contact, but it was also verbal for the first time. He used his word. Now, he continued to start adding words as I began to understand his world better. But that was a moment in my life with autism where I realized I had to create a bridge. I couldn't just expect this kid, these children or adults, to step over into my world and know the rules and know what to do and know how to handle it, to trust me if I wasn't willing to try to learn what perspective they were coming from. I have so many stories where I had to learn how to communicate in a way that showed I wanted to build that bridge. As a speech language pathologist, you think you should know these things. But also as a brand new teacher, I didn't. And it was this amazing journey for me to get from that first year teaching as a speech language pathologist, that first year, to move into now and still find myself learning how to cross those bridges, learning how to build those bridges, learning how to understand. And I feel like I'm a constant student, but I also care a great deal about building those bridges. So that is your little story. I have so many of them. That is your little story for Autism Awareness Day, and I hope you have a good Friday.